The first step that I go through when creating a pendant is the planning phase. I do this on my phone and use a sketch app with layers, but you can also do this by layering sheets of paper or using multiple squares next to each other and repeating the same design. Now, if I know I want to start with a specific idea, like a circle, I'll go ahead and create that initial circle and then build from there. So for this pendant, I knew that I wanted to do a large circle with the stone set low, and I started the design building a bunch of figure eight kind of wings for this scarab feel that I was going for. And then to fill the center, I decided that I would look at doing a channel setting. And then I have a tendency to fill empty spaces with gradiated beads, so this is where I decided that I would start with small beads and fill that up, and then potentially expand the figure eight to fill in that extra space. Now, once I have a good idea, I move on to designing. And here I just lower the opacity of my piece, or if I was working on paper, I would put a piece of tracing paper over top of it, and I start to build each layer of my piece. Now, I'll start out with my frame, for instance, and I'll write myself notes. In this case, I know that I want the basic frame to be a soldered ring. And so I'll write that note down and go ahead and save that layer. Then I'll start with my next layer, and I'll start building the next piece that I want. I'm going to build a figure eight, and this is where I decide, do I want my figure eight to be two different pieces, one piece? How am I going to make this work? And I want this to be the same wires, so I made that a note. And here is where I figure out if I'm starting in the middle and I want to move outward on each side, how am I going to end off those wires at the end? So I draw out my layer with my figure eight weaves and the end of my wire, and then I started thinking about what am I going to do with these four ends. In this case, I decided I'm going to do some loops to create prongs that will help hold the stone in at the top, or at the bottom in this case, and then at the top I would build either a loop, potentially. This is where I was deciding if I could bring those wires upward into the channel setting. I changed my mind and decided, what if I bring them downward behind the stone, and they will create the backing behind the stone so that it can't fall backwards. And this is just me changing to a lighter color so that I can indicate to myself that this is behind the stone. And then that gives me the second layer of my planning, and I continued onward to the third layer at that point, and that layer is going to be my channel setting. And I know that I'm going to do a small channel setting, and I'm going to put a single stone in there. I've already chosen that stone. I knew that I wanted a green stone in the bottom, and I wanted a small blue sapphire. Now, I write notes to myself, like how many base wires do I want? How many is it going to need? And this is just an approximation of what the basket weave around the channel setting is going to look like. And now I have the ends. What am I going to do with them? I knew I wanted to bring the top backwards and make a hidden bail. And for the bottom, I have to figure out what to do with the four wires that are going to come out of there. So I decided to make with the outer wires, potentially I'm going to do a prong setting with my loops again like I did at the bottom, and then bring the two center pieces down. And then after thinking about it for a minute, I decide that I wanted to bring the two inner wires outward and bring them kind of upward through the center of my figure eight to create kind of an accent. I like to run twisted wires or wires up the center of my figure eight weaves to create kind of a break in the weave. And this is where I kind of make a note to myself how I want to tie off those wires up at the top on either side of the channel setting. From there, I go ahead and I add my last layer, and this is me deciding what I'm going to do behind the stone. And this is, it may seem really simple. This is just me kind of looking at ways to do different things. I'm going to take these wires and I'm going to wrap the back wires together. And as you'll see, because it's behind the stone, I can use the wires at the top and the bottom. They don't have to line up, and I'll run the beads through those. And that way I have a structural piece, but I'm also able to string my beads that I want to string. And as you can tell, once I put all my layers together, I kind of have an idea of what it's going to look like, and it's a mess. You don't have to be a great artist to be able to do this. You just have to be able to make an approximation, something that tells you what pieces you need to work on in what order. At this point, we move on to wrapping our design. You can see that I started with my soldered ring as I'd planned in the first step and layer of my drawing. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and start creating the second layer, which is my figure eight weave that starts in the center. So here I have my figure eight weave finished, just like I did in my drawing, and I've left my wire ends long enough that I can connect them along with following the way that I had it set up. So you can see the other pendant where it's finished, and I know what my plan is for this one. So the second thing that I worked on was the channel setting, where I've done the channel setting at this point, and now I'm working on the back end because I know that I want to swing these backwards according to my plan and create that hidden bail. So I went ahead and connected these wires here to hold that on and start connecting everything. And this is where sometimes you kind of break off from your drawing. So in my drawing, I had not taken into account what I would do with the parts of the channel setting that used that went around the stone, the half round at the top. So this was my solution for that. And sometimes when you get the pendant in your hand, you'll see that there are things you didn't plan out. But the more you do it, the more you'll get used to picking out every piece and what needs to be adjusted. Now, one thing that you'll notice here is that my initial piece that I had been planning, I've already finished. It's sitting in the background, and this is the second piece that I've built. Of course, I didn't think to video on the first one. So in this case, I'm actually already aware of what I needed to do with these pieces because I had fiddled around until I decided what I wanted to do on the original piece. And so at this point, I'm ready to take the wires that I had planned out to create my prongs and set the stone down at the bottom. And per my drawing, I've already taken the top of the figure eight weave and created that backing for the stone. So I just set it on there, and now I'm wrapping my loops to hold that stone in place. And if you're wrapping loops like this, you can do like I'm doing here and kind of freehand it, or if you prefer, I find using round tip pliers can work out really well. I just can't always get them to work when I'm working in tight spaces like this, so I went ahead and just decided to wing it on this guy. And then I'm going to get in here and take the end of this wire and end it off right here on the frame as it was set up in the plan. This is another part that I didn't really plan for initially, but I discovered, and when I started creating my initial pendant, I realized that the bottom prongs being large loops, they weren't holding quite good enough together. And so I created a small figure eight weave at the base of these as well in order to hold this together. And this is just kind of one of those things when you're building these pendants, sometimes you have to adapt or figure out a way to make these pieces work that is a little bit different from the sketch, but you'll figure out as you're working on these more and more how to adjust your plan in a way that works. So I just slid the stone in so that I didn't pull these too close together, and then started creating my figure eight weave with an idea of exactly how tight I needed to pull these in order to get everything working properly. And I'm going to skip through this part because most of the time my hand's down underneath the screen anyway, but I just ran the figure eight weave a slight amount on the bottom just to hold those loops together. Once I finished with that part, I had the two pieces from the top channel setting, and as you can see in the drawing, those are supposed to loop around and create a kind of prongs on the top that will hold the stone in, and then I was going to bring them around the sides to create kind of those lines between the wings, but I didn't actually make the ends of the wire long enough for me to accomplish that, so I ended up just looping them around and tying them off in the back. And later on I'll show you where I went in with a different wire and actually ran those lines up the middle of the figure eight weaves with just a piece of accent wire, since this didn't work. And it's you'll see in quite a bit of the video where there are little things that don't quite work out based on your drawing, and you just adjust a little bit, but it's really a plan that you have to be willing to deviate from a slight amount as you work, and the wire will really tell you what is and isn't going to work. But as far as having a plan to start with and knowing what you want to do, it's really good to have that sketch over there that lets you know what you had planned, where you were going to put things, and for the most part, if you have to adjust, it's going to be small adjustments like adding that figure eight weave or tying off a wire a little bit early and adding an extra piece to continue, instead of things like having wires and just having no idea what you're going to do with them. So once I finished putting those top loops on, I have these nice long ends that I left at the top of the channel setting, and I was going to trim them off, but as you see in the sketch, I'm supposed to run some wires from the bottom up to the top to do these gradiated beads, and I figured rather than running extra wires after clipping these off, why don't I start at the top and then run these wires downward and tie them off at the bottom. And so I went ahead and stuck my graded beads on as I had planned, and then brought these long wires downward and tied them off at the back behind the stone, which still allowed me to pull all the wires behind the stone together with the ends of these wires. And as I'm pushing things through here, you'll see that I kind of go in and do a lot of poking and prodding just to make sure that those beads fit into the right place and that they're filling that empty space exactly how I wanted them to. Make sure that I'm tightening the wires to exactly where I want them before I tie them off in the back. So there's a lot of fidgeting that goes on until I'm done and happy with the final piece here. And now I'm pulling a piece of square wire. I'm going back to that channel setting on my other layer where I had planned to run those back wires up the sides, and I just didn't leave myself enough room on the ends of the wire. So instead, to give myself a little bit more interest, I took this 20 gauge square wire and I spun it with my drill, and that's going to give me a nice accent wire with a little bit of twist to it. And I'm just going to run that behind the stone and up both sides of the figure eight weave, and use the same exact plan that I had before with tying it off at the top right next to the channel setting. It's just going to be a different piece of wire instead of a continuation of the ends, and that's something that I would work on in the future, fixing at the next time I make this pendant, making sure that I leave enough room at the end of that wire, because it is still a good way to tie off those wires. I had just messed up, and this is me working around that mess up to make sure that I still get the design that I'm looking for. Now, as I'm ending this off, you'll notice that I've left a much longer tail on this than would be needed, and that's because one other thing that bothered me about the pendant setup is there's a bit of a gap between my gradiated beads and my figure eight weave. So I'm going to take these tails that I've left myself since I had to run new wire anyway, and I'm going to wrap it in a half round and then run it along that side there to kind of fill that gap in. Again, you'll see there's a lot of fidgeting that I put in, pushing these wires to make sure that they're running exactly where I want them to be along the figure eight, making sure that there's similar shapes and similar positions on each side so that the pendant is symmetrical, and then straightening out these ends that I've left myself so that I can add my half round wire around them and then run it. And you can do other fun things like adding colored seed beads instead of the half round. You can do a lot of different stuff to just kind of add a little bit of interest and fill that side. Now you could also just fill it with this twisted wire if you wanted to, but I wanted the wire that's in between the figure eight and the wire that's closing off that gap to stand out from each other a little bit more. I didn't want them to be the exact same design. So I'm just going to take this half round and wrap it around and fill that space. So I'm going to go ahead and skip past this part where I wrap the half round and move on to the last piece of the puzzle, which is the bail of the pendant. And here we have, once the half round was wrapped, I have a couple pieces of wire ends that are left, and I'm trimming them off and cutting them down, smoothing out any edges, and then preparing. On the back of the pendant you can see this hidden bail that I've left from the channel setting, and I just need to connect my wires from the half round and my bail wires right here in order to finish off the pendant. So usually what I'll do here is just create two little loops and tie those loops down with some weaving wire, and that's what I've done with the half round wire that I wrapped on either side of the beads, and I'm finishing that off, and then I will do the same for the bail. And a lot of time and effort goes into trying to keep clean backs on my pieces, so I will spend a lot of time smoothing out these areas, trimming them down, and also making sure that I file off any points or things like that. So you'll notice that I do a lot of fidgeting when I'm doing this part. When I created the loops with the end of the half round, I centered them on the pendant, and I'm just going to take these two tails from the bail and I'm going to tuck them through those loops and go ahead and press them through and use those to pull the bail down tight against the back of the pendant. And this is one of those things where I just kind of push it through until I can get a hold of it with the pliers, and then I'll pull it down tight at that point. You can see the edges just barely making it through that loop right now. And after I've gotten it looped through tightly, I went ahead and tightened that down, making sure that the points were pointed inward and not somewhere where they were going to snag or catch. And now I'm just going to take this last tail from my figure eight and make sure that it's tied off somewhere so that it's not going to come loose. And then after I tie it off, I'll trim it off and go back for one last round of kind of poking, prodding, and fidgeting to make sure that all my ends are where I want them to be, everything's lined up the way it's supposed to be, that my symmetry is good. If it's a little bit off, I'll start moving things around and kind of pressing them into place so that I'm happy with everything being centered and where it's supposed to be. And that'll give me that final piece that I'm happy with. And that's basically the process that I go through when I start my sketches and work through to a finished piece. I'm going to put this phone back up here in the corner and show you that original sketch that I had gone through, and you can kind of compare it to the final pieces. There are a few differences, but it came out pretty similar to what I was looking for, and I was happy with the design. It's got a nice clean back. Everything was planned out and put places where it fits good. So if you were helped out by this, or if you think it's a good video, go ahead and like and subscribe. I'm going to try and put out a lot more of these as I go to try and help you build a pendant from scratch to finish.